In 1941, the United States began sending billions of dollars worth of military equipment, vehicles, raw materials, and food to a country it hadn't signed a treaty with, didn't share a border with, and whose ideology it openly opposed. No money changed hands, no contract of repayment was required. But behind the public rhetoric of helping allies, a binding financial mechanism was drafted, one that would silently transfer power, shift the post-war balance, and lock in global economic influence for decades. It was called the Lend-Lease Master Agreement. Most history books describe it as a wartime aid program, an act of generosity. But the real value wasn't in the tanks, trucks, or aircraft. It was in the structure of the deal, the legal language, the credit terms, and the timing. Because while the Allies were fighting for survival, the United States was negotiating for the future. And it negotiated like a creditor, not a partner. By 1945, over 40 countries were bound by Lend-Lease, not just militarily, financially. It created the illusion of support without the optics of profit. But functionally, it was an investment with a long maturity. Even the repayment wasn't measured in money. It came in diplomatic leverage, trade conditions, gold reserves, and political alignment. Here's the paradox. The more aid Washington gave, the more control it gained. Because in global finance, debt is never just an obligation, it's a lever. Some historians believe Lend-Lease was the opening move of a new financial empire, a network of debtor nations constructed in the fog of war. And once the guns fell silent, that network didn't dissolve, it evolved. Today, few remember that the Soviet Union paid off its Lend-Lease balance in 2006, or that Britain's final payment came just the year before. This wasn't just aid, it was architecture. In the winter of 1941, the world's financial core had already shifted, but no one dared to admit it. London was still seen as a center of global finance, Paris had collapsed, Berlin was burning through reserves, and Washington was quietly becoming the lender of last resort. Europe was on fire, but the American economy was accelerating. Unemployment, which had plagued the U.S. through the Great Depression, dropped sharply. Industrial output soared. Why? Not because of domestic demand, but because war abroad created artificial demand at home. Factories that once made refrigerators were now stamping out gun barrels. Civilian car production halted in favor of tanks and jeeps. Steel, aluminum, rubber, all diverted, priced, rationed. And most of it wasn't going to American troops. It was being shipped overseas, to Britain, to the Soviet Union, to Free France, to China. But shipping tanks across oceans costs money, a lot of it. So who paid? That's where the political brilliance of Lend-Lease revealed itself. Roosevelt knew that Congress and the American public would resist outright war financing. The trauma of World War I debt repayment still lingered. Allied countries had defaulted, and the political cost had been high. So Lend-Lease was designed as something new, not a loan, and not a gift. It was aid, but repayable only in ways that could be negotiated later. In raw materials, future services, strategic cooperation. No fixed amount, no interest rate on paper. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. The headline, An Arsenal for Democracy. The subtext, a global supply chain, financed on credit, structured through diplomacy, governed by Washington. By the end of the war, the total value of goods delivered under Lend-Lease reached approximately $50.1 billion, equivalent to over $750 billion today. To Britain alone, over $31 billion. To the USSR, nearly $11 billion. The volumes were unprecedented. But here's the mechanism hidden in plain sight. The U.S. retained legal title to all Lend-Lease goods until they were either destroyed, used up, or returned. That clause turned every shipment into a conditional transaction. Legally, America owned the tanks it sent to the Red Army, owned the ships used in the Arctic convoys, even owned the aircraft flown from Alaska to Siberia. This ownership wasn't enforced during the war, but after 1945, it created leverage. Suddenly, these weren't gifts, they were assets. And where there are assets, there is negotiation. The master agreements, signed by recipient countries, starting with the United Kingdom in February 1942, were not vague gestures of goodwill. They were binding legal frameworks that governed repayment, future trade terms, and post-war cooperation. Each one contained an identical clause. The government of the United States does not seek repayment in dollars, but an equivalent economic benefit to the United States. Vague? Yes, but powerful. Because who decides what equivalent economic benefit means? Washington did, case by case. And now imagine, a war-torn country, dependent on American shipments, signs a financial agreement without knowing the price. This is how strategy works when written in legal ink, not military code. It wasn't exploitation, it was design. Debt, after all, doesn't need to be called debt. Sometimes it's enough to create an obligation with no exit terms. The moment of fracture didn't come with explosions. It came with paperwork. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the war was over, but the ledgers were just opening. The problem was immediate. The Allies had won militarily, but economically, they were exhausted. National treasuries were drained. Gold reserves were minimal. Debt had swollen beyond pre-war proportions. Yet obligations remained. And one of the largest was the vague, open-ended promise embedded in the Lend-Lease Master Agreements, equivalent economic benefit. But how do you measure that? For Washington, the answer was simple, through negotiation, one country at a time, on U.S. terms. The very structure of Lend-Lease guaranteed this. Because it had no fixed repayment plan, no upfront valuation, no interest rate, every post-war agreement became a blank canvas, and the brush was held by the U.S. Treasury. Take the United Kingdom. In 1946, deep in crisis, it needed another lifeline. The British Empire was dissolving. Imports had collapsed. Rationing continued. So London returned to Washington, not just for new aid, but to settle the old accounts. Negotiations began. On one side, Lord Keynes, economist, architect of Bretton Woods. On the other, U.S. Treasury Secretary Fred Vinson, backed by a booming surplus economy. Keynes had warned years earlier, if we accept unlimited debt, we surrender our sovereignty. He was right, but there was no alternative. The result? The Anglo-American Financial Agreement of December 1945. Britain agreed to repay $4.34 billion over 50 years at 2% interest. But even that wasn't the whole price. As part of the deal, Britain was forced to make the pound sterling fully convertible to dollars by 1947. A seemingly technical clause, but economically devastating. Because when convertibility took effect, it triggered a run on Britain's dollar reserves. Within weeks, the system collapsed. Convertibility was suspended. Confidence shattered. Why did the U.S. insist on it? Because dollar convertibility opened global markets to American exports and eroded Britain's ability to maintain preferential trade within its own empire. It was more than repayment. It was realignment. Now consider the Soviet case. In 1947, the U.S. demanded $1.3 billion from Moscow as settlement for wartime aid. The Soviets countered with an offer of $170 million. The negotiations froze. The Cold War was already crystallizing. No agreement was reached. But the debt remained. In 1972, amid détente, the U.S. and USSR finally signed a protocol. The Soviet Union would repay $722 million by 2001, but payments stopped after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The remaining debt was later passed to the Russian Federation, which made the final installment in 2006. This was a 65-year repayment timeline for aid that had supposedly come with no strings attached. In both East and West, the story was the same. Aid during the war transformed into leverage after it. Because aid, when structured through legal ambiguity, becomes a contract with invisible ink. And here lies the deeper problem. Lend-Lease wasn't designed for peace. Its legal framework didn't expire with the war's end. It mutated. The same logic that once powered convoys and supply chains now governed balance sheets, trade restrictions, and long-term diplomatic alignment. It created relationships where no country was fully sovereign, only as independent as its repayment terms allowed. And the key clause, equivalent economic benefit, remained undefined, deliberately. It gave the United States something no other country had: post-war discretion. Imagine being able to rewrite the value of a contract after the other party has already consumed the goods. That's not diplomacy. That's financial gravity. Because once you fall into it, you don't negotiate, you orbit. Now let's strip it down. How exactly did Lend-Lease work? Not politically, but mechanically. It started with a premise. The United States would supply war materials to allied nations without immediate payment. That's the headline. But beneath it was a detailed administrative pipeline, mapped, priced, and timed to the minute. Step 1. Allocation. Foreign governments submitted detailed requests: tanks, locomotives, copper, wheat. These were reviewed by the Office of Lend-Lease Administration, which assessed need, military priority, and shipping feasibility. Step 2. Authorization. Once approved, U.S. producers received orders, not from Britain or the USSR, but from the American government itself. This was key. The U.S. didn't just deliver goods. It bought them from its own companies, using its own budget, then transferred them abroad. It wasn't just aid, it was industrial policy. The money flowed into American factories, shipyards, railways. Jobs were created, plants expanded. The U.S. economy retooled, not despite the war, but because of it. Then came Step 3, title transfer. Under Section 5 of the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. retained ownership of all materials until the President declared them destroyed, lost, consumed in use, or otherwise unfit for return. That phrase, consumed in use, did the heavy lifting. Once a tank was blown up, a bomber shot down, or a ton of wheat eaten, it was considered spent, no repayment. But if a truck survived, a ship remained intact, or a tool was reusable, technically it was still U.S. property. What does that mean in practice? It means that after the war, America had the legal right to demand the return, destruction, or buyout of unused goods. And it did. Thousands of aircraft were reclaimed. Entire convoys of equipment were sold back or scrapped, sometimes at discount, sometimes at full value. But the real mechanism wasn't the stuff, it was the structure. Because once a country signed a Lend-Lease Master Agreement, it became part of a supply chain governed not just by war needs, but by U.S. commercial law. Payments didn't have to be in dollars. Economic benefit could take the form of military bases, access to resources, post-war procurement contracts, or trade preferences. In Britain's case, this translated to leasing American air bases in Newfoundland and Bermuda. In France, it meant opening up colonial trade routes to U.S. companies. In the Soviet Union, despite ideological resistance, it meant dependency on American ball bearings, aviation fuel, and communications equipment, vulnerabilities that didn't vanish with peace. Now think in systems. This wasn't just aid, it was a dollar-denominated pipeline. American industry was feeding foreign militaries, but the control valves remained in Washington. Each shipment had an invoice, even if it wasn't settled immediately. Each delivery created a record, a ledger entry, a future point of negotiation. And perhaps the most brilliant piece, the act itself was unilateral. The president could terminate or extend Lend-Lease at will. No need for multilateral coordination, no formal treaty, just an executive decision backed by congressional funds. This made Lend-Lease more flexible than a treaty, more binding than a loan, and more profitable than a gift. It blurred the line between diplomacy and commerce, between wartime urgency and post-war planning. And once the war ended, those lines didn't disappear. They hardened. Because when a financial structure survives its original purpose, it becomes something else: a model, a tool, a precedent. If a tank can win a battle, a contract can win the next 30 years. The war ended. The agreements did not. By 1946, nearly every major recipient of Lend-Lease aid found itself in a paradox. Liberated militarily, but constrained financially. Because the real cost came after victory. First came the balance sheets. Nations were asked to account for every crate, every bolt, every gallon delivered under Lend-Lease. Not to repay in full, but to settle, to formalize obligations. For Britain, that meant $4.34 billion, repayable over 5 decades. For France, $427 million. China, $50 million. Each settlement came with its own terms, but one pattern held true. The U.S. defined the value, not just in dollars, but in leverage. In some cases, entire inventories were discounted to pennies on the dollar. In others, the U.S. demanded compensation in raw materials or strategic concessions. These weren't negotiations between equals. They were structured by circumstance. War-torn nations didn't have negotiating power. They had needs. Currency shortages, infrastructure collapse, political instability. And they were dealing with a creditor that now held 75% of the world's gold reserves. So repayments weren't just financial. They became political currency. In 1947, when Britain failed to maintain dollar convertibility, a key clause of its Lend-Lease successor loan, the pound sterling collapsed. Imports vanished. The U.S. withheld further assistance. The message was clear. Financial discipline was now part of geopolitical alignment. In the Soviet case, refusal to agree to U.S. repayment terms widened the rift. A diplomatic freeze followed. Credit channels closed. The Cold War took financial form. But the consequences went deeper than national budgets. Lend-Lease had redrawn the map of financial sovereignty. Colonial empires weakened, not by war, but by debt. Trade routes shifted toward U.S. suppliers. Central banks, forced to hold dollars, quietly recalibrated their reserves. A new dependency took shape. It wasn't enforced by armies, but by spreadsheets. And as nations entered the post-war order, they found their autonomy limited not by occupation, but by access to dollars. The U.S. became the world's central warehouse, creditor, and market, all at once. This wasn't just economic dominance, it was architecture. The Lend-Lease Master Agreements had normalized the idea that massive flows of goods and capital could bypass standard repayment models, but still produce long-term influence. That concept would echo into the institutions of the future: the IMF, the World Bank, the Marshall Plan. Aid as leverage, credit as power, terms as weapons. By 2006, when Russia made its final Lend-Lease payment, most of the world had forgotten the system even existed. But its mechanisms, legal ambiguity, open-ended benefit, structural alignment, were still in use. A policy that began with tanks ended in trade dependency. That's not a side effect, it's a design principle. It didn't end, it changed names. What began as Lend-Lease now lives on in the architecture of modern finance, dressed in different terms, operating on the same logic. Then it was aid in exchange for equivalent benefit. Today it's conditional assistance, development lending, or structural adjustment. But the structure hasn't changed. Start with the International Monetary Fund. Created in the final phase of the war, 1944, Bretton Woods, it was born in the same financial atmosphere as Lend-Lease. In fact, many of the same architects helped design both systems. The logic was identical. Emergency liquidity, provided quickly, with repayment terms that were flexible in theory and deeply binding in practice. Countries in crisis receive funds, but not without conditions: fiscal austerity, privatization of public services, deregulation of currency markets. What does that mean in practical terms? It means governments cut social spending, freeze wages, or sell state-owned assets, not to their people, but to service obligations written by external creditors. Austerity is the modern repayment in kind. And just like with Lend-Lease, the lender doesn't demand cash, it demands structure. In 2023, over 90 countries were under active IMF programs. Many of them, from Argentina to Egypt to Pakistan, found themselves trapped in cycles of borrowing, repayment, new borrowing, and deeper dependency. A tank is no longer delivered, but a credit line is, and in return, the country adjusts its economy, aligns its policies, opens its markets. This is the new version of economic benefit. And now consider foreign military financing, another echo. Today, the United States provides billions in military aid to strategic allies: Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and others. But most of that aid doesn't flow in cash. It comes in the form of weapon systems, contracts with U.S. manufacturers, training programs, all designed and executed within U.S. procurement rules. Just like Lend-Lease, it stimulates domestic industry while reinforcing foreign alignment. The recipient receives equipment, but the supply chain remains American. The parts, the upgrades, the ammunition, all flow from U.S. firms. Dependency is embedded in logistics. Even debt relief has become a channel of influence. In recent years, initiatives like the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring allow creditor nations to renegotiate obligations from the Global South, but only under rules they define. Reform your tax system, liberalize capital flows, open up critical sectors. It's still aid, but now the invisible ink is called compliance. The mechanics haven't changed. An undefined benefit, a delayed repayment, a system where sovereignty bends, not from coercion, but from calculation. Then it was Lend-Lease, now it's conditionality. But the result is familiar. A global system where the flow of resources, oil, data, labor, capital, follows the same gravitational pull toward those who define the terms. History didn't change, only the label did. Some contracts don't expire, they replicate. Lend-Lease was not a footnote of World War II. It was the prototype of a financial system that could move faster than armies, last longer than treaties, and operate without needing to declare itself. It didn't just win a war, it rewrote the conditions of peace. Today, we live inside the logic it created. Help is never free, credit is never neutral, and repayment rarely ends at zero. Because in the language of systems, debt is not a burden, it's an instrument. And whoever writes the terms writes the future. This story didn't end, it simply changed form.